All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to your digital program. This is Horses to Horsepower, building the nation's first transcontinental railroad. I'm so happy to be here with you here today. We are waiting on a class or two to get before we get started here. In the meantime, I'm going to show you a music video that one of our friends of the museum, Andy Fletcher, made, showcasing some of the best parts of the museum, some of our favorite locomotives here. And that's a great way to start. You get to see so much of our museum all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We're going to show you that video. When we come back on, it should only take us about a minute or two for that video. We'll go ahead and start learning.
At the California State Railroad Museum, lots of locomotives, we want to see them. Bring your questions to the information stand. The docents will answer, give them a hand. The catboard so mighty, did it run on oil when it crossed on her pass with its toil? Where was it built? How much did it weigh? What was it like when steam ruled the day? At the California State Railroad Museum, lots of locomotives, we want to see them. Bring your questions to the information stand. The docents will answer, give them a hand. Virginia and Truckee 260, how much could it pull? How fast could it go? Virginia and Truckee engine would shine in the sun. Virginia and Truckee's a railroad you can still see run.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Now that we are all here, we can go ahead and get started. I'm joining you from the California State Railroad Museum. We are located in Old Sacramento State Historic Park, and that's in Sacramento, California, just a couple blocks away from the state capitol building. And I'm joining you from the Transcontinental Railroad Gallery. If you were here in person, this would be the very, very first place you would go after buying a ticket. You would come in this room and learn all about the Transcontinental Railroad, how it was built, and what its lasting impact on us here today is. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today, what the Transcontinental Railroad was and how it still impacts us here in California. So we're going to start by breaking that word transcontinental down a little bit. So trans means across, and continent means continent. And so a transcontinental railroad is any railroad that goes from one side of a continent all the way to another. So I have a couple maps to show you. These are the major railroad networks in the United States before the Transcontinental Railroad was built. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of red networks over here on the East Coast. And so if you were living over here and you wanted to stay on the East Coast, well, that wasn't too bad. You could go from somewhere like New York, maybe down to Florida, or somewhere else on the East Coast by train, and that would be pretty convenient. But if you maybe heard about the gold rush here in California and you decided you wanted to make your fortune out on the West Coast, you couldn't get over here by train. And so if you've ever heard of the Oregon Trail or those really long boat rides all the way around South America, that's where you get that. So the Transcontinental Railroad then is the railroad network that changes everything. It's this line right here connecting all these railroads on the East Coast all the way over here to California. The United States wanted this railroad built so fast and so badly, they said that one railroad company was not going to cut it. We need two railroad companies working at the exact same time to speed things up a little bit. And so we had the Union Pacific starting in Omaha, Nebraska. They built out towards California. And then we had the Central Pacific starting just a couple blocks away from where we are today, building out towards the east. And as you might imagine, building a railroad all the way across the continent took quite a lot of work. It took over 20,000 railroad workers and over 6 years of hard work to complete. Here at the California State Railroad Museum, we like to say that our lives are made of railroad stories, and we tell the story of things like the Transcontinental Railroad through the stories of people. And so we're going to have a total of 3 video stations for you here today. They're each going to focus on different individuals and people that helped make that Transcontinental Railroad possible and help shape our lives here today. In between those video stations, I'll come back on, I'll answer some questions you may have. We do have a Q&A section. If there's any point in the program where you have a question about what railroads are like in the past, what they're like today, or anything else that comes up, that's a perfect place to drop your question. If you don't have access to an individual device, just save your question for later, and we'll do a live Q&A at the end of the program as well. And we might be able to have your teachers type in for you if you guys don't have access to that yourselves. All right, with that, we're going to jump into our first video station, focusing on Theodore Judah and his dream for the Transcontinental Railroad.
Have you ever had a dream, or have you just wanted to do something so badly no one was going to stop you? Well, that's how Theodore Judah felt about building the Transcontinental Railroad. It was his dream to build it, and no one was going to stop him from doing so. But what is the Transcontinental Railroad, and why was Judah's dream of building it so important? Well, for one thing, California had just had a gold rush, and people from all over were coming to California to try and find their fortune. But at the time, there were only 3 ways you could get here. The first way was to walk or ride a horse all the way across the entire country. This could take anywhere from 6 to 8 months, and it was very difficult to travel this way. Many people didn't survive the trip west. Another way you could get to California was to board a boat in New York and sail all the way down around the bottom of South America and back up to California. This trip also took about 6 months. The final way you could get here was by boarding a boat in New York, sailing down to Panama, walking through the jungles of Panama, and then boarding another ship and sailing back up to California. This way only took about 3 months, but people often caught deadly disease. Transcontinental Railroad, which would allow people to cross the country in days rather than months. From the time Theodore Judah was a child, he loved railroads. In fact, when he was just 14 years old, he was helping to run a railroad in New York. When he turned 28, he got an offer to help build a railroad in California from Sacramento to Folsom. He quickly accepted this job offer, and he and his wife Anna left for California. Although this project didn't last long, it was his opportunity to start working on getting the Transcontinental Railroad built. Once in California, Judah started to do a survey of his desired route from Sacramento through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Judah's wife Anna often accompanied him during these surveying trips. She helped keep him organized and even helped sketch the surveyed land. Eventually, after about a year of surveying, Judah found a route through the Sierra Nevada mountains at Dutch Flat. Judah went to the Congress in Washington, D.C. to try and get funding to build this railroad. But unfortunately, this attempt was unsuccessful due to many different opinions on where this route should actually be. Upon returning to California, he went to San Francisco to look for investors, but again was turned away as interest lied in shipping rather than trains. Eventually, Judah received help from 4 wealthy businessmen in Sacramento named Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. They would later be nicknamed the Big Four, or the Associates. They provided Judah with money so that he could complete his survey of the Sierra Nevada mountains as well as make a map of his preferred route. Now, armed with this knowledge and this map, Judah and Anna went back to Congress in Washington, D.C. once again to convince them again to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And this time in July of 1862, Judah was able to convince Congress of the need of the Transcontinental Railroad, and Abraham Lincoln signed it into law. Lincoln saw Judah's dream of the Transcontinental Railroad as a way of unifying the nation during the Civil War, a time of great division. Eventually, Judah and the Big Four split up because of a disagreement with Judah about how the project should be run. Judah, not wanting to give up on his dream, went back to the East Coast once again to look for new help completing the project. Unfortunately, on the ship ride over to the East Coast, he contracted yellow fever and passed away shortly thereafter in New York. He never got to see his dream completed, but nevertheless, his dream of the Transcontinental Railroad changed the history of California and the country forever.
All right, everybody, welcome back. In that last station, you heard about the Sierra Nevada mountain range. That was the mountain range that Theodore Judah hiked through, surveyed, and eventually found that route for the Transcontinental Railroad to be built. In the Sierra Nevada mountain range is still a place that a lot of us go to quite often. If you've ever been to a place like Lake Tahoe, Donner Lake, Yosemite, if you've ever been from Northern California over to a place like Reno, Nevada, you've passed through the Sierra Nevada mountains at some point. And one thing you'll notice if you go through the Sierra Nevadas is that the rock is made out of hard granite rock. It's very difficult to break granite rock. You'll also notice that a lot of the mountains are very, very steep. They're very, very high. And that's kind of a problem for railroads because railroads aren't like roller coasters. If they come across a mountain, they can't just go up and over a mountain. And with the Sierra Nevadas, they're so densely packed together, you can't always go around the mountain either. And so if you can't go up and over the mountain and you can't go around the mountain, that really only leaves us one option, doesn't it? And that is to go directly through the Sierra Nevada mountains, go directly through the mountain, build a hole through the mountain large enough for a train to fit through. As you might imagine, that would be quite a lot of work. And I'm going to actually show you one of the tools they had to build this railroad. This is the primary tool to get through the Sierra Nevada mountains. As you might see here, there's no on button, there's no electric power, there's nothing like that that's going to give this and make this job a little bit easier. This is called a star drill. It gets its name because the front here kind of looks like a star. And the way it's going to work is one person's going to hold it like this in place, and the mountain's going to be right there. And then somebody else is going to hit it with a sledgehammer, and they're going to turn it a little bit, hit it again with a sledgehammer, turn it a little bit, and so forth. And so, as you might imagine, that would take quite a long time to do that and then make it big enough for a train to fit through, especially through hard granite rock. So that's what we're going to learn about next in our next video station. We're going to be learning about what that work progress looked like, as well as the conditions of the people that actually built this railroad.
Building a railroad is tough, hard work, and the Central Pacific had the difficult task of building a railroad up and over the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Chinese immigrants made up 90% of the workforce. They graded roads, bored tunnel through solid rock, laid track, and built bridges. They had to cut down trees and clear dense brush. They cut away land in some places and filled it in other places. And they did it all by hand because there were no steam shovels, power drills, or tunneling machines. Instead, they used picks and shovels, wheelbarrows, carts, and horses. The men worked 10 hours per day, 6 days per week. Work in the Sierra was the toughest of all because of how brutal the Sierra winters were. The winter of 1866-1867 brought more than 40 snowstorms. 40! The snow was so deep, the men working up there built snow tunnels to get around in. but they kept working. The railroad ran 24-hour shifts with Chinese workers chipping and blasting away at the solid granite rock. The railroad hired more than 10,000 Chinese men to do this work. Have you ever tried to break a rock? If you have, you know it's a really difficult thing to do. Well, imagine chipping away at a mountain built of rock and building a tunnel big enough for a train to get through. From 1865 to 1867, Chinese railroad workers built 15 tunnels. The most difficult was tunnel number 6, or Summit Tunnel. This tunnel was 1,695 feet long. That's almost 5 football fields lined up end to end. The Chinese worked day and night. Using a star drill, something similar to this, one man would hold it in place while another pounded it with a big, heavy hammer. And when he hit it with the hammer, the other man would turn it a quarter turn. Hammer, turn, hammer, turn, hammer, turn, all day until they made a hole that was about 2.5 feet deep. When they had several of these holes, they put in black blasting powder, and then they packed it with straw and mud and lit a fuse. Boom! It blasted away the rock, and the workers would carry away the rocks in baskets and wheelbarrows. Day after day after day after day they did this. Now, what do you think it would be like to work in a tunnel like that? It'd be cold, it would be dark, and very loud as you blasted deeper and deeper into the mountain. Your supervisor would be yelling at you to work harder, and the air would be so dusty and confined that it would be very hard to breathe. It was very difficult work. Many of the men died in blasting accidents or in avalanches in the mountains, but the Chinese continued to work hard, and they finished the tunnels in the summer of 1868. By the way, the snow was so bad the Central Pacific built 37 miles of snow sheds, like the one that we have here in the museum. Some people call that the longest barn in the world. Well, for all this work, the railroad paid Chinese workers less than white workers. By June of 1867, Chinese earned about $35 a month, which equals out to about $600 in today's dollars. White workers made more, plus the railroad paid for their food and lodging. Chinese workers wanted $40 a month and to work 8 hours a day instead of 10. When the railroad refused, 5,000 workers went on strike. It was the largest strike of its time. This was very bad timing for the Central Pacific because they had a very strict time schedule to meet. Time was money, and the more tracks they built, the more money they made. Still, they refused to pay the Chinese what they asked for, and they cut off their food supply. After a week without food, the Chinese went back to work without the raise in pay that they had demanded. But they made their point. They stood up for themselves, and it was a sign of their collective strength. The Chinese proved to be very hardworking and dependable. They had to deal with extreme prejudice from other white workers and from supervisors. But they eventually earned the respect of Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins, the Big Four, who could not have built the railroad without them.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So as you heard, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was a historic accomplishment that could not have been completed without the hard work of the Chinese railroad workers who worked in more dangerous and difficult positions for less money. When the railroad finally was completed, as you might imagine now that we can go across the country in as little as 7 days and 7 nights, People were very excited to take that journey. In fact, so many different places across the country had a really big celebration. And they timed that celebration with the railroad's completion. At the site where it was completed, called Promontory, Utah, they had their own very special party called the Golden Spike Ceremony. And you might be wondering, how did everyone across the country know that that party was happening? And how did they all time it together? Because this is before cell phones. They couldn't just call up their friends in a different city and say, hey, we're going to be having our celebration at 3 o'clock, and you should have yours then too. In fact, the way they did it instead of by phone was something called a telegraph. So this is a mock-up of what a telegraph was like. And so the best way of thinking about it is kind of like text messaging today, but instead of having that full keyboard where we can type out all the letters we want, we even have numbers and symbols and things like that, emojis, all that great stuff. Instead, you just have one single button. And so you can press it and it makes a small beep. I'm not sure if you guys can hear it. That's what it sounds like. And so they had to figure out a way to get this one button to represent all the different letters in the alphabet. And the way they did that was by creating something called Morse code. You might have heard of that before. And that's a combination. Each letter was assigned a combination of shorts, which is where you press it down for a short period of time. So that's a short, and longs, where you hold it down a little bit more. And so each letter is a combination of that. So you might have a short, short, long, and that would be one letter. You might have a long, long, and that would be a different letter. And so they were able to use that. They were building these, putting up telegraph wires, kind of like telephone wires today, all across the country as they were building out that Transcontinental Railroad. And so when they finally completed the Transcontinental Railroad, they also sent the first transcontinental telegraph message as well. And that was part of the reason people were celebrating the completion. So what did that big party look like in Promontory, Utah? Well, we had a bunch of different dignitaries from both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific there to help celebrate its completion. We had a bunch of other famous people there as well. In addition to the people, there are a couple of important spikes that went as well. These are parts of the railroad. They they look like big nails, right? And they hold down the railroad tracks. And so to commemorate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, different people donated special spikes, ceremonial spikes, to make the celebration a little bit more special. One of the ones we talked about the most here was 2 golden spikes donated by a man named David Hughes. And he made 2 that were basically the exact twins of each other. And he said, Leland Stanford, you're one of the big 4. You're going to be going over to Promontory to help celebrate the Transcontinental Railroad. And you get to take one of these 2 twin gold spikes. You get to take one, I'll keep the other one. And so Leland Stanford took one. If you want to go see that one, the one that was actually at Promontory, you can still see it to this day at Stanford University on display. But if you want to see the one that David Hughes kept, its exact twin, you can come here to the California State Railroad Museum. We actually have this one on display here. So that's something that's very, very special about our museum. All right, well, now that the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad is all completed, people can move across the country in as little as 7 days and 7 nights. But our story here today doesn't stop there. We're going to be talking in our next video about agriculture and how the Transcontinental Railroad helped change the way we ate forever.
At our last stop on the tour, we're going to talk about 2 things that had a powerful impact for the railroad in America: the refrigerator car and California agriculture. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, hundreds of people could travel by train from New York to California in about 7 days. What do you think California could send back to the East Coast? It wouldn't make much sense to send back empty train cars. How about produce? In California, the milder climates allow us to grow lots of produce year-round. Fresh fruits and vegetables like lettuce, broccoli, and oranges could be all packed into these empty boxcars and travel by rail back east. This opened the market for California farmers to feed the nation. After a week in a boxcar, the produce wouldn't be so fresh. Imagine eating a salad that was made from lettuce that was sitting out on your countertop for a week. It would get wilty, slimy, and no amount of ranch dressing would fix it. The refrigerator car would fix this problem. In the late 1870s, the refrigerator cars were introduced to the railroad. These are boxcars cooled by big blocks of ice cut from frozen ponds in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The ice would help California produce stay fresh a little longer. You're all used to it now, but really think about how this would change everything in the 1870s. Now let's pretend that we're visiting New York City in the 1870s. It's winter time and we're looking for a restaurant for dinner. Most of the menus that you would read would offer preserved produce like spinach or maybe peaches. The restaurant next door visited the farmer's market at the railroad station. Their menu has salad with fresh lettuce, tomatoes, along with fresh strawberries and cream for dessert. I would want to eat fresh produce over canned. This was a game changer. You're used to it now, but think about how that changed everything in the 1870s. Today, you could travel anywhere in America, even the world, and find fresh fruits and vegetables. The refrigerator car was a pretty good system, but still, things change and improve over time. In comes the story of our next innovator, Frederick Jones. Frederick was the child of a black mother and white father. He lost both his parents by the time he was 9 years old. What Frederick was able to do over his career without the support of parents or even a formal education is truly amazing. As a young man, he held a variety of technical jobs: a foreman at a garage, a mechanical engineer, and a sergeant in World War I working as an electrician. He taught himself mechanical engineering and picked up his other skills on the job. When he was 20, he earned his engineering license. He and a partner successfully developed an electric refrigerator and established the U.S. Thermal Control Company, later called Thermo King. By the 1930s, Frederick's designs of a large electric refrigeration unit were widely being used in homes, trucks, and railroad cars. Food could be transported over long distances without worrying about melting ice. His inventions opened the door to shipping foods all around the world and started the rise of portable frozen meals. Frederick patented 60 inventions over his career. 40 of them were related to refrigeration. The next time you visit your refrigerator, pour yourself a glass of ice water and make a toast to the great contributions of Frederick Jones. Today, California is an agricultural powerhouse. We're living during California's second gold rush. If you add up the value of all the gold that was mined in California over the past 160 years, it would be worth about $25 billion. Now that's a lot of cash, but in 2019 alone, California produced over $50 billion worth of agriculture. Modern agriculture was made possible by the railroad and the inventions that refrigerated and transported our foods.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So as you heard in that last station, the Transcontinental Railroad still impacts us today because of how it helped shape California's economy involving farming. As you might remember, the gold rush was very important to California. But as you heard, we make more money off of our agriculture than all the gold in the gold rush combined. All right, well, we are at the end of our scheduled portion of the program. If we have any questions that you guys have been holding on to, this is a perfect time to put it in the Q&A. As you guys do that, I'll answer a couple of the ones that we commonly get and see if that inspires anybody to have a question out there. One of the questions we get a lot is how much progress did they make each day with the Transcontinental Railroad? And that's a really good question. So how many miles of track or how much track was built every day? And the answer would be, it really just depends on where you are in the process. So if you're building the railroad through the mountains, you're still in the Sierra Nevadas, you're going to measure how much progress you're making in inches. And so at the end of the day, you might just be a couple inches closer to the other side of the mountain than when you started the day. And so you weren't thinking about miles of track built, you were thinking about inches. But when you get a little bit closer, now we're past the Sierra Nevadas. Now we don't need to worry about blasting through the rock of the Sierra Nevadas anymore. We can go a little bit faster. In fact, I'm kind of blocking it right now, but this says 10 miles of track laid in one day, April 28th, 1869. And this was set by those same workers, the Chinese railroad workers that at one point were measuring their progress in inches, then went on to set the record. This is still the record. Even today, we have never been able to lay more tracks than what was laid on this day. 10 miles of tracks in a single work day. That is quite an accomplishment and something, as I mentioned, we have never been able to do again. And so that was very, very important. And that shows that the amount of progress you're making on the railroad just depends on where you are. We got a question from Denise asking what happened to the Transcontinental Railroad? Is it still running here today? That's an awesome question. So the original route has been modified a bit. We've been able to make it faster and even more efficient than it was back in the day. Instead of taking 7 days and 7 nights, if you were to take that railroad route today, you might be looking at something like 3 to 4 days, depending on where you got on from. But most of that route is still the same. And so, yes, you can pretty much still take that Transcontinental Railroad route. If you want to take the train across the country, you can still get that done. Are there real trains from the gold rush times in the museum? That's another really good question. So we have trains from the earliest period for the Transcontinental Railroad. In fact, if I turn the camera around, you'll see that same train that we saw at the beginning of this program from the other angle. So this is our Governor Stanford locomotive. That was the big black one at the beginning of the program. That is our earliest railroad train in the museum. It was built in the early 1860s, and one of its biggest historic significances is actually helping make the Transcontinental Railroad possible. It was one of the first trains to be going on that route regularly and helped in the construction process. And so if you come here to the Railroad Museum, we have a total of 22 either train cars or locomotives, and you can learn about the difference between those. But of those, a good portion of them are from the time period we're talking about, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. This one currently cannot run. It's too old. It doesn't actually work anymore, but you can still admire it. It still looks really pretty, and you can still learn a lot about what trains in the past were like. And then we do have other locomotives in the museum that do still operate on a regular basis for us. We have something called an excursion train route, which just means that for fun, people will go on our trains. They'll go about 3 miles along the river, turn around and come back in the same direction. And some of the trains in our collection that you'll see here inside the museum will also work over on that line, and they do still run and they do still work. All right, let's see if we got a couple more here. Are the spikes that I showed you earlier, like the gold spike, that same shape, is that still what they use when train tracks are being laid today? Yes, they may, most likely the actual metal and certain improvements have been made to make them stronger and safer and all of that. But for the most part, broadly, train tracks are laid in the same general, using the same general ingredients. They use something called ballast, which is the rock. If you ever look at a train track and you think there's just rock underneath there, it's actually a special kind of rock called ballast that helps keep the railroad tracks stable and in place. You'll have the ties. You'll have the tracks and the spikes. And the ties are that wood portion that goes this way. The tracks are the metal part that kind of goes straight at you. That's what the train rides on. And then the spikes still keep the tracks to the ties together. So broadly, yes, it's kind of complicated, but essentially it's still that same process. How long did it take for the tunnel to be made through the Sierra Nevada mountains? That's another really good question. So it depends on how big that mountain is. And so if we're talking about one of the smaller mountains, it may only take you a couple of weeks, a couple of months. Again, that's still quite a long time to just get through one mountain. But if you're talking about the largest mountain they had to go through, called Summit Tunnel, that's going to take over a year. going to take about 18 months. And the only reason it was even that short of time, they thought originally it was going to take 3 years, but eventually they were working on both sides of the mountain at the same time. And so they were both blasting away, and that sped up the process a little bit faster. And then they realized, okay, well, that's still taking quite a long time. Why don't we drill down into the mountain from the top and then kind of use that as 4 faces to be working on. So they had 4 different sort of faces to be working on to create that tunnel, and that sped up the process, but it still took about 18 months. Let's see. We got a question asking, why was it the Chinese railroad workers that built the Central Pacific side of the railroad? That's a really good question. So broadly, there's some push and pull factors that are going to bring people to California. And then there were some push factors that made people want to leave China to be able to work somewhere else. And some of the push factors include things like there was a war going on in China at the time. And so sometimes it was safer to make money for your family over somewhere else overseas. They also went to places like Australia, as well as the United States. So it wasn't just all here in California, they went other places as well. And then there's some pull factors. Originally, people wanted to, same thing with people wanting to get from the East Coast to the West Coast. Sometimes people wanted to find gold or other things, make their fortune here in California. And so many of the same things that brought people from the East Coast to the West Coast brought people from China to the United States. Once they were here, though, there was some discrimination that took place, something called a miner's tax, which was a special tax for Chinese miners trying to find that gold for the gold rush. And because of that tax, it was less profitable for them they made less money actually trying to find that gold. And so many decided, okay, well, if I can't make my money finding gold, if I'm being discriminated against and they won't let me essentially make as much money doing that, I'm at least going to go try to work for the railroad and send some money home doing that. And so that's some of the broad reasons why it ended up being mostly Chinese laborers. All right. Looks like that's about all the questions that we have here today. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I know we have some 4th graders on, so before you guys head out, if you have time, I just want to let you know about the Adventure Pass program. That's a program that gets 4th graders and their families into a total of 54 state parks completely for free. And so that's something we definitely recommend signing up for. If you're in the Sacramento area, it's really easy to sign up. You just go to the Railroad Museum, and we will help you sign up. You can do it online, but it's a little bit confusing, so we recommend just showing up to the museum. And we are one of the 54 state parks. So if you show up with your family to the Railroad Museum and you're a 4th grader, you guys get in for free. Just ask about the Adventure Pass program. All right. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest.